It's December 1823. President James Monroe sits down to write his annual message to Congress. What he writes will echo for 200 years. Monroe declares that the entire Western Hemisphere belongs to America. Not through military conquest, through diplomatic proclamation. He tells the world, Europe, stay out. America claims this hemisphere. Don't try to establish new colonies here. Don't try to restore colonial rule. Don't try to spread your monarchies across the Atlantic. This hemisphere is ours. It's audacious. It's bold. It's one of the most remarkable foreign policy declarations in history. And it's delivered by a nation that can barely defend itself. A nation with almost no navy. A nation whose borders are still being negotiated with Britain and Spain. Yet, Monroe declares, this entire hemisphere is under American protection. This becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine. For 2 centuries, presidents will invoke it. It will justify American intervention across Latin America. It will shape how America sees its role in the world. But here's what most people don't understand. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't really Monroe's idea. It wasn't even about defending Latin American independence. It was about establishing American empire. And it was driven by one man, John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State, who saw in this doctrine a chance to transform America from a republic into a hemispheric power. This is video 16 of Jackson's America, and it's the story of how America went from defending itself to claiming an entire hemisphere. To understand why Monroe issued this doctrine, we need to understand what was happening in the world in 1823. Europe had just survived the Napoleonic Wars, 20 years of fighting, millions dead, an entire continent traumatized. Napoleon had been defeated in 1815, but his shadow still haunted Europe. The monarchs of Europe were terrified of one thing: revolution. They'd seen how revolution could spread. They'd seen how democratic ideas could undermine monarchical rule. So Europe's kings and emperors made a deal. They would work together to crush any revolution anywhere. This agreement was called the Concert of Europe. 5 great powers, Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, agreed to maintain the existing order, to suppress revolutions, to keep monarchies in power. Russia, Austria, and Prussia went even further. They formed the Holy Alliance, explicitly dedicated to using military force to crush revolutions. This worked in Europe. When revolutions broke out in Italy, the Concert of Europe crushed them. When Spain had a revolution, the Concert of Europe considered military intervention to restore the monarch. The Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich was the architect of this conservative system. Metternich was brilliant. He understood that if revolutions succeeded anywhere, it would inspire revolutions everywhere. So he built a system to stop them before they started. But then something happened that terrified European monarchs even more. Spain's colonies in Latin America revolted. One after another, Spanish colonies declared independence. Venezuela declared independence in 1810, Colombia in 1813, Chile in 1818, Argentina in 1816, Peru in 1821, Ecuador in 1822. By 1823, most of Latin America had broken free from Spanish rule. These weren't minor uprisings. These were complete revolutions. These were colonies that became independent nations. For European monarchs, this was catastrophic. If Spain couldn't keep its American colonies, what did that say about the security of other empires? More importantly, if colonies could successfully rebel and become independent republics, it would inspire colonies everywhere to try the same thing. It would inspire people everywhere to question whether monarchy was necessary at all. So the Holy Alliance, particularly Russia and Austria, considered using military force to reconquer the Latin American colonies. They would restore Spanish rule. They would crush the independence movements. They would show that rebellion against monarchy could not succeed. There was another threat too: Russia. Russia was expanding its colonial claims on the North American Pacific coast. Russian fur traders had posts from California to Alaska. Russia was even claiming territory in what is now Oregon. Russia's far eastern ambitions were growing. The Russian Empire was one of the largest in the world. It stretched from Europe all the way across Asia to the Pacific Ocean, and now it was reaching across the Pacific toward North America. American policymakers looked at this expansion with deep concern. If Russia could establish itself on the Pacific coast of North America, it would block American westward expansion. It would create a rival empire on the continent. So, American policymakers faced two distinct dangers. First, European monarchies might invade Latin America and establish themselves as powers in the Western Hemisphere. Second, Russia was expanding its territory in North America. This is the situation that prompted Monroe's Doctrine. But here's the interesting part. Britain didn't want European powers in Latin America either. Why? Because Britain wanted to trade with independent Latin American nations. Britain wanted those markets open to British goods. You see, Latin America had declared independence, but it needed to buy goods. It needed manufactured items, tools, cloth, weapons, all the things industrial nations produced. Britain was the world's premier industrial nation. Britain's factories could produce these goods cheaply and efficiently. If European monarchies reconquered Latin America and restored Spanish rule, Spain would implement trade monopolies. Spain would only allow Spanish merchants to trade with Latin America. Britain would be shut out of these lucrative markets. But if Latin America remained independent, Britain could trade freely. Britain could sell its goods to Latin American nations and make enormous profits. So George Canning, Britain's foreign secretary, had a brilliant idea. Britain would propose a joint declaration with the United States. Both countries would warn Europe, stay out of the Americas. Britain knew that if both America and Britain opposed European intervention, Europe would think twice. Even without American military power, British naval power was enough to make the difference. So Canning reached out to the American ambassador in London. "Let's issue a joint declaration," Canning proposed. "Let's warn Europe that the Western Hemisphere is off limits." This is where John Quincy Adams comes in, and Adams makes a decision that will change the course of history. John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State under James Monroe. He was brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless. Adams came from one of America's most prominent families. His father was John Adams, the second president. His mother was Abigail Adams, one of the most remarkable women of the founding era. He'd been trained for greatness since childhood. He spoke Russian, French, German, and several other languages fluently. He'd served as ambassador to Russia, Prussia, Britain, and other countries. He was arguably America's greatest diplomat. But Adams wanted to be president, and he understood that a bold foreign policy could help his political ambitions. Adams understood something crucial that many politicians missed. If you can make a bold claim and back it up through clever politics, the world will accept it. When George Canning's proposal arrived, Adams faced a choice. Should America issue a joint declaration with Britain, or should America act alone? This might seem like a small decision, but Adams understood what it really meant. If America issued a joint declaration with Britain, it would appear that America and Britain were partners, equals working together. It would appear that America was acting because Britain asked it to. But if America issued its own declaration, if America spoke in its own voice, asserted its own policy, then it would appear that America was the driving force. America would appear as an independent great power, not as Britain's junior partner. Adams argued passionately for the American position. "Don't make this a joint declaration with Britain," he insisted. "Make it an American doctrine. Let America speak for the hemisphere. Let America be seen as the power protecting the Americas." Why? Because Adams believed in American independence and American power. He didn't want America to be seen as following Britain's lead. He wanted America to be seen as standing alone, projecting its own power. Adams said something remarkable in the cabinet debates. He said, "It would be as much more candid as it would be more dignified for the United States to avow these principles egotistically of ourselves as to come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war." A cockboat in the wake of a man of war. That's what Adams was afraid America would become, a tiny boat following in the wake of a larger ship. But Adams had a larger vision. Adams believed America could be a great power in its own right. Adams won the argument. Monroe agreed. America would issue its own declaration, not a joint one with Britain. Monroe incorporated Adams's thinking into his December 1823 State of the Union address. He embedded the declaration in a routine message to Congress. That made it seem like a statement of American principles rather than a specific threat directed at any particular nation. It was brilliant strategy. By making it part of a routine State of the Union address, Monroe made it seem like these were just natural American principles being expressed, not a new and aggressive foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine had 4 key parts. First, America won't interfere in European affairs. We accept that Europe is your sphere of influence. We're not going to send armies to Europe or meddle in European politics. Second, Europe can't establish new colonies in the Americas. The age of colonization in the Americas is over. Any attempts to create new colonies here will be seen as unfriendly acts toward America. Third, Europe can't try to reconquer colonies that have become independent. This is directed at Spain particularly. Don't invade Latin America. Don't try to restore Spanish rule. Fourth, any European interference in the Americas will be considered a threat to American peace and safety. This is the threat. If you violate these principles, America will consider it an act of war. This was an extraordinary claim. America was essentially saying, we own this hemisphere. We will determine what happens here. You can do what you want in Europe, but the Americas belong to us. But here's what's crucial to understand. The Monroe Doctrine was backed by no American military power.
The American Navy was weak. It had fewer than 10 ships of the line, the largest warships. Britain had over 120 ships of the line. France had 60. Spain had 20. America could not fight any of these powers alone. The American army was small. It had maybe 10,000 soldiers. Most were stationed on the western frontier, protecting settlements from Native American resistance. America couldn't project military power across the Atlantic. So America couldn't actually enforce this doctrine against European powers using military force. The doctrine worked because of Britain. Britain didn't want European monarchies in the Americas. Britain wanted those markets open to trade. So Britain would enforce Monroe's declaration, not for America's sake, but for Britain's own interests. If Russia or Spain tried to invade Latin America, Britain's navy would stop them. Monroe and Adams knew this. They knew Britain was the real power behind the doctrine. But they presented it to the world as an American declaration, as American power, as American determination to protect the hemisphere. It was brilliant politics. America got credit for hemispheric dominance, but it was really British naval power that made it work. So what did the Monroe Doctrine actually mean? On the surface, it meant America was claiming the right to be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. It meant America would tolerate no rival power. It meant America was declaring itself an empire. Not a traditional empire controlling territory directly, but a modern empire with a sphere of influence where it could dictate what happens. It sounded like Monroe was protecting Latin American independence from European monarchies, and technically he was. But the Monroe Doctrine also meant something else. Latin America was now under American dominance. This distinction is crucial. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't really about protecting independent nations. It was about preventing European powers from competing with America for influence in the hemisphere.
Latin American leaders understood this. Many were grateful that Europe wouldn't invade. They understood that if European powers reconquered their territories, they would lose their independence. The Monroe Doctrine prevented that. But they also understood that they were now under American dominance. Simón Bolívar was the great liberator of South America. He unified much of northern South America under independent rule. He created nations. He led armies. He was a military genius. But Bolívar was skeptical of the Monroe Doctrine. He understood it was an assertion of American power. He understood that America's protection came with strings attached. He understood that Latin America was now in America's sphere of influence. Yet Bolívar also recognized that the Monroe Doctrine protected his newly independent nations from European reconquest. If European powers couldn't invade, then his nations were safer. Most Latin American nations accepted the Monroe Doctrine with deeply mixed feelings. They were grateful for the protection, but they were also concerned about American ambitions. The Monroe Doctrine was also intimately connected to American expansionist ambitions. Americans in 1823 were already dreaming about westward expansion. They believed in what would later be called manifest destiny, the belief that America's destiny was to expand across the entire continent. But Mexico controlled the Southwest. British interests extended south from Canada. The continent wasn't empty. Other powers had claims. The Monroe Doctrine essentially told Britain, don't expand further south.
Don't try to claim more territory in North America. The Americas are America's sphere. You stay in Canada. We'll expand into the Mexican territories. This cleared the way for American westward expansion. It removed British competition. It set the stage for the Mexican-American War. It paved the way for American dominance on the continent. John Quincy Adams understood this completely. In his diary, Adams wrote extensively about his vision of American continental expansion. He believed America would eventually stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. He believed America would control the entire continent from the Arctic North to the tropical South. Adams wrote that he expected America to eventually control all of North America and much of South America. He was even explicit that Cuba would eventually become American. He predicted American expansion into Mexico, California, Oregon, and everywhere else.
The Monroe Doctrine was the first step toward that vision. By declaring the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European powers, America was clearing the way for its own expansion. But there was a price. The Monroe Doctrine meant American dominance would shape Latin American development. It meant Latin Americans would have less control over their own futures. It meant they would be subordinate to American interests. It meant that when America wanted something from a Latin American nation, America could apply pressure. America could threaten military intervention. America could use economic coercion. The Monroe Doctrine gave America the right to intervene in Latin American affairs whenever America deemed it necessary. Here's the great historical irony of the Monroe Doctrine. It was presented as protecting American republican principles. Monroe was defending independent republics against European monarchies. He was protecting the Americas from autocratic rule. But the Monroe Doctrine became a tool for American domination and eventually American support for autocracy. In the 1950s, when the CIA helped overthrow the elected government of Guatemala, they justified it with the Monroe Doctrine. The Guatemalan government was becoming too friendly with communism, they said. America had the right to intervene in the hemisphere to prevent Soviet influence. The Monroe Doctrine gave America that right. In the 1960s, when America supported a military coup in Brazil that overthrew the democratically elected president, the Monroe Doctrine was invoked. Again, the reason was preventing communist influence in the hemisphere. When America invaded Panama in 1989 to overthrow Manuel Noriega, they cited the Monroe Doctrine. America had the right to intervene in the hemisphere, they said. So the doctrine that Monroe presented as defending liberty became a tool for crushing it. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, President Kennedy invoked the Monroe Doctrine to justify American action against Soviet missiles in Cuba. Kennedy essentially said, "The Monroe Doctrine means the Soviet Union cannot establish a military presence in the Americas. We will not tolerate Soviet missiles 90 miles from our coast."
Kennedy was using the same logic that Monroe had used 140 years earlier. America had the right to determine what happened in the hemisphere. America could intervene to protect its interests. The Monroe Doctrine was the justification. This created enormous resentment in Latin America. Latin Americans understood what the Monroe Doctrine really meant: American domination. They resented American support for dictators. They resented American intervention in their internal affairs. They resented being told their hemisphere was under American control. The Cuban Revolution, for example, was partly a reaction against American domination established by the Monroe Doctrine. Fidel Castro and the Cuban revolutionaries saw themselves as asserting Cuban independence against American hegemony. Castro said explicitly that the Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine of American imperialism. He said it gave America the right to dominate Latin America. He said Latin America needed to resist it. Today, the Monroe Doctrine is less relevant. Latin American nations are more powerful. They can assert their interests independently. They have their own military forces. They participate in international organizations. They're not as vulnerable to American pressure. But the legacy remains. The idea that America has the right to dominate the Western Hemisphere, this principle remains embedded in American foreign policy. American presidents still invoke it occasionally. American foreign policy still assumes American primacy in the hemisphere. American military policy still includes defending the hemisphere from outside interference. The doctrine that Monroe issued in 1823 still shapes American thinking about the Americas today.
The Monroe Doctrine's impact extended far beyond Latin America. It established a principle that would shape American foreign policy globally. America has the right to establish spheres of influence. America can intervene when necessary. America can determine what happens in regions it considers strategically important. By the end of the 19th century, America was becoming a global power. The Monroe Doctrine provided an intellectual foundation for global American dominance. The idea that America had the right to dominate a hemisphere evolved into the idea that America had the right to dominate the global order.
President Theodore Roosevelt explicitly embraced this thinking. Roosevelt saw America as a great power with global responsibilities. Roosevelt believed America should be a dominant world power. Roosevelt extended the Monroe Doctrine thinking. Just as America dominated the Western Hemisphere, Roosevelt believed America should have a strong presence in other regions too. Roosevelt sent the American Navy to the Pacific. Roosevelt established American power projection capabilities globally. Roosevelt even invoked Monroe Doctrine principles in Asia. When Japan was becoming too powerful in East Asia, Roosevelt applied Monroe Doctrine thinking to Asia. America needed to maintain influence in Asia, he said. America couldn't allow one power to dominate Asia, just as America wouldn't allow one power to dominate the Americas. In the 20th century, America applied Monroe Doctrine thinking globally. During the Cold War, America used the same logic that Monroe had used 140 years earlier. America established military bases all over the world. America maintained a global military presence. America intervened in distant regions when America deemed it strategically important. America told the Soviet Union, "You can't have influence in this region. America controls it." The Monroe Doctrine thinking extended to Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Middle East, Europe, virtually every region of the world. America's assumption was that America had the right to maintain influence in every part of the globe. Today, America maintains military bases across the world. Over 800 military bases in roughly 70 countries. America projects military power globally. America intervenes in distant nations when it deems it strategically important. This is an extension of the principle established by the Monroe Doctrine. America has the right to determine what happens in regions it considers part of its sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't the only cause of American global dominance, but it was an early and important expression of an imperial impulse that would characterize American foreign policy. So why does the Monroe Doctrine matter for our story about Jackson's America? Because it shows how American foreign policy was evolving in the 1820s. In the War of 1812, America fought for survival, fought to assert independence from the world's greatest power, fought to prove that America could exist as an independent nation. In the Monroe Doctrine, America transitions to thinking about dominance. Not just surviving, not just defending itself, but dominating a hemisphere. Andrew Jackson will be the political leader who takes this vision and implements it. Jackson will lead America into war with Mexico. Jackson will oversee aggressive displacement of Native Americans westward. Jackson will expand American power and territory using the Imperial framework established by Monroe and Adams. Jackson believed in American expansion. Jackson believed America had the right to dominate the continent. Jackson believed the United States should stretch from ocean to ocean. But Jackson is operating within an intellectual foundation laid by Monroe and Adams, the framework that says, America has the right to expand. America has the right to dominate its sphere of influence. America has the right to pursue its destiny, regardless of the cost to others. The Monroe Doctrine set the stage for everything that comes next. It provided intellectual justification for westward expansion. It cleared the way for the Mexican-American War. It created the framework within which Jackson would operate. Jackson didn't invent this imperial thinking. Jackson inherited it from Monroe and Adams. Jackson just made it real. Jackson took the theoretical claim to hemispheric dominance and turned it into practical expansion and conquest. But we should be clear about what the Monroe Doctrine justified. It justified the Indian Removal Act. Jackson used Monroe Doctrine thinking to remove Native Americans from their lands. America had the right to control the continent, the thinking went. Native Americans were in the way, so they had to be removed. It justified the Mexican-American War. America wanted Mexican territory. The Monroe Doctrine meant America had the right to expand in the hemisphere,
so America attacked Mexico and took half its territory. It justified American support for slavery expansion. Slave owners wanted to expand slavery into new territories. The Monroe Doctrine meant America could do what it wanted in the Hemisphere. No external powers could stop it, so slavery expanded. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't directly causing these things, but it provided the intellectual framework. It provided the justification. It said, America has the right. Don't question American expansion. The Monroe Doctrine declared that America had the right to dominate a hemisphere. It was an assertion of power by a nation that didn't actually have the military strength to enforce it alone. But it worked. It worked because the intellectual claim was audacious enough and Britain's naval power was strong enough that Europe accepted it. And it established a principle that would guide American foreign policy for the next 2 centuries. In 1824, America faces a different kind of crisis, not foreign policy, internal politics. The presidential election of 1824 will be the most controversial election in American history until the Civil War. Andrew Jackson will win the popular vote. Jackson will win the electoral vote, but Jackson will lose the presidency to John Quincy Adams, the man who wrote the Monroe Doctrine. And Jackson's fury at this betrayal will set him on the path to power. Next time, the corrupt bargain of 1824 and how political treachery launches Andrew Jackson toward the presidency.